The worst part wasn't the silence, it was the backpack. Dropped right by the swings at Magnolia Park, half-zipped, with a juice box still inside. No footprints, no screaming, just a soft wind, a fading sunset, and a pink glittery backpack that should have gone home with Lily Walker. 9 years old, brown hair in a braid. Favorite shoes, rainbow sneakers. Smart, shy, and always home by 4:15. Except today. At 4:32 p.m., her mom called the school. At 4:39, she was driving around the neighborhood. By 5:10, the sheriff's department had the entire park sealed off with yellow tape, and a rescue grid was forming. People showed up in droves, neighbors, teachers, even teenagers with flashlights. They combed the woods, peeked into old sheds, yelled her name into bushes. But as night fell and cold settled over the sleepy Oregon town, the voices faded. The light faded, and hope started to do the same. Officer Daniel Ruiz was on hour 14 when the call came through. Another missing kid. Another frantic parent. Another ticking clock. He looked down at his partner, Echo. The black and tan German shepherd sat like a statue beside the cruiser, tongue curled, ears perked. A little older than most canines, Echo had never been the fastest or flashiest dog. But he had something else, something deeper. He felt things. Dan couldn't explain it, but Echo always knew which door to pause at, which closet to stare at, which bush held something more than leaves. When others gave up, Echo lingered. And sometimes that was all it took. They arrived at Magnolia Park at 6:42 p.m. The scene was calm but tense. Media vans parked at the edge. Flashlights dotted the fields. A drone buzzed overhead. A volunteer coordinator handed Dan a laminated map of the search radius. She vanished right after school, the man explained. Witnesses say she was on the swings, alone. Then, nothing. Backpack was found here. He pointed to the base of a slide. Dan nodded and clipped Echo's leash. Let's get to work. He gave the command, and Echo lowered his nose, weaving along the grass, around benches, toward the trees. For 15 minutes, Echo circled, sniffed, turned back. He paused at a chain-link fence, sat, whined. Dan took note. Something? Echo moved again, this time toward the creek bed that ran beneath the park. A concrete storm drain mouth opened just ahead, covered in moss and rust. Echo stopped, stared at it, tail low, ears stiff. Then he whimpered. Most dogs bark. Echo mourned. Dan stepped forward, peered into the pipe. Nothing but darkness. He pulled out his flashlight and scanned the inside. Just moisture on concrete. Leaves. No sound. No movement. A search supervisor behind him frowned. Already checked it. Small drainage tunnel. Just runoff. Doesn't go far. Echo thinks otherwise, Dan replied. He's just picking up old scent. Maybe. Dan let Echo stay by the pipe while he continued the search elsewhere. But every time Echo was called away, he returned. Same spot, same silence, same eyes locked on the void. By midnight, most teams had packed up. Rain started to fall. Lily was still missing. The next morning's headlines said what no one wanted to admit. Search for Lily Walker comes up empty. At the sheriff's office, Dan stared at the corkboard map. Echo lay on the floor beside him, paws tucked, eyes alert. Every few minutes, he looked toward the door. You still think she is there? Dan asked quietly. Echo didn't move. Dan grabbed his coat. They returned to the park alone. No news crews, no volunteers, just early sunlight and damp leaves. Echo jumped out of the cruiser before the engine even cut. He went straight to the pipe. Dan followed. There was something about Echo's posture. Rigid, unblinking, not alert, but pleading. Like the dog wasn't trying to point at something. He was begging Dan to believe him. Dan knelt. All right, buddy, one more time. He leaned into the pipe, shined his flashlight. Still nothing. Then, he thought he saw movement. He blinked. Nothing. He turned the light off, waited. Seconds passed. Then something. A tiny sound, like fabric scraping concrete. And then a hand, small, trembling, pale. It slid out from behind a bend in the pipe, fingers reaching, barely moving. Dan's heart froze. "Lily," he whispered. If stories like this move you, don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals on YouTube. We bring you real stories of brave canines and silent rescues that might otherwise go unseen. Every like and share helps more people believe in second chances and four-legged heroes. Dan radioed it in. Paramedics, fire rescue, backup. He crawled partway into the tunnel, speaking gently, guiding her with his voice. When they pulled her out, she was soaked, shivering, and barely conscious. Dehydrated, cold, but alive. Wrapped in a foil blanket, she whispered just loud enough for Dan to hear. "I heard the dog." "What?" "The dog. He was there. I stayed awake 'cause I heard him." Echo sat beside the stretcher, licking her wrist gently as the medic worked. His tail moved once. They later learned she'd been followed after school by a man in a hoodie. No one saw it. She panicked and ran, squeezing through the brush and crawling into the storm drain to hide. She'd gotten lost in the dark and fallen asleep. When the rain came, she stayed put, afraid if she moved, she'd never find her way out. She said she felt like no one was coming, until she heard the dog outside the pipe, and she knew someone hadn't given up. The press didn't cover that part. The footage showed the rescue, the ambulance, the crying parents, but not the canine who stood vigil at a hole in the ground when everyone else had packed up. Not the whimper that woke a girl from fading sleep. But Lily would never forget. Neither would Dan, and neither would Echo. The local paper called it a miracle. Lost girl found in storm drain, thanks to canine hero. Pictures ran front and center. Lily Walker wrapped in a silver emergency blanket, her face pale but her eyes open. Echo sat beside her like a statue, the perfect portrait of calm and loyalty. But by the next morning, the miracle was already being dissected. News vans rolled out. Reporters moved on to the next fire, the next political scandal. And while Lily was recovering at the hospital, while her parents cried in the hallway and thanked every god they could think of, questions started to circle. Whispers, doubts. She must have wandered in there herself. Why didn't she yell sooner? Maybe it wasn't an abduction at all. Are we sure she didn't make it up? Officer Dan Ruiz heard it at the precinct first. Someone dropped a manila envelope on his desk labeled Lily Walker, internal note. Inside were typed reports, analysis of the timeline, commentary from a behavioral analyst out of Salem. The phrase possible fabrication or trauma-induced confusion had been underlined. Dan stared at the page for a long time. Then he looked down at Echo, curled up beside his boots, tail lightly flicking. "She didn't make it up," he said softly. Echo opened one eye. Dan knew that look, the "we're not done yet" look. A few days later, Dan stopped by the hospital. Lily was awake, but still quiet. Her parents were there, polite but tired. The air in the room felt heavy, like everyone was bracing for something. Maybe blame, maybe just more questions. Lily didn't speak much, but when she saw Echo, her eyes lit up. She motioned for him to come closer. Echo trotted to her bedside and rested his head gently on the mattress. That's when she whispered, "He came back." Dan knelt beside her. "You remember what happened?" She nodded slowly. "I ran. A man. He was wearing dark clothes. I think he was following me." "Did you see his face?" She shook her head. "No, just boots. And his voice. He told me to stop." Dan felt his chest tighten. "And that's when you hid in the pipe?" "I wanted to wait until he left. But then I got lost. It got dark and I fell asleep. But I heard Echo outside. He was the only one." She paused. "I knew I wasn't invisible anymore." Dan typed up a full report and turned it in. It got filed. No further questions were asked. The sheriff's office said there was no surveillance footage, no physical evidence of an abduction. They chalked it up to a child running from fear. A misinterpretation. Case closed. Dan knew better. So did Echo. He went back to the scene, alone this time. The storm drain had been covered with temporary fencing, but the area beyond the park still felt wrong. Not the crime scene itself, but something nearby. A stillness that didn't sit right. Echo was on edge again. Not barking, just watching. Dan let him lead. They walked past the edge of the park, through overgrown brush, and into a wooded area that wrapped behind a storage facility and a seldom-used maintenance road. About 100 yards in, Echo froze. Then he lowered his head, started sniffing in circles. Dan followed. "What is it, buddy?" Echo stopped at a tree trunk where the grass had been flattened. Next to it, something small, a crushed juice box. Dan's stomach turned. Same brand that was in Lily's backpack. He knelt down. "You're saying she made it this far?" Echo wagged once. They searched for another hour. Found more signs. A footprint. Partial but large. A torn piece of fabric stuck to barbed wire. Dan photographed everything. It wasn't nothing. But it wasn't enough for a case. That night, he brought the evidence to a contact. Mia Reynolds, a local crime analyst who used to work for Portland PD before burnout drove her out of the city. "Looks like she was chased," she said after reviewing the layout. "She didn't just run and hide. She was being hunted." Dan nodded, but no one believes it. "They don't want to believe it," Mia said, sipping her coffee. "You open that door, and suddenly you've got a predator operating in a suburban park. You think the mayor wants that headline?" Dan looked away. "So we do nothing?" Mia slid the juice box back across the table. "We keep looking. Off the books." Echo and Dan went back every night that week. Each time, Echo led them to something new. A scent trail near a utility shed. A rusted flashlight under a pile of branches. A section of fence that had been bent open and tied back with zip ties. Too many coincidences, not enough proof. Dan documented it all, quietly building a file at home. If the department wouldn't take it seriously, he'd make sure someone did. And then, on Friday night, Echo did something he hadn't done since the day they found Lily. He sat in front of a pile of rocks and whimpered. Dan moved the rocks aside. Beneath them, hidden in a shallow dugout, was a torn black hoodie, too small for an adult, too large for a child. Inside the pocket, a burner phone, battery dead. Dan held it up in the flashlight beam. "Got you." Back at his house, Dan charged the phone using a universal cable. It powered on. No contacts, no text history. But in the gallery, a single photo, a blurry image of the Magnolia Park sign. Time-stamped for 2 hours before Lily went missing. Someone had scoped the place. Dan's fingers clenched around the phone. He called Mia. "You were right." By the next morning, the photo had been traced to a disposable email backup tied to 3 other burner devices used in reported loitering incidents across the state. Outside schools, daycares, even a public pool. Whoever this person was, he'd been traveling, watching, and now he was gone. Dan walked into the station Monday morning and dropped the phone on the captain's desk. "You need to reopen the case." The captain frowned. "Where did you get this?" "Off the books. Echo tracked it." "You understand this isn't proper chain of custody." "Chain of custody didn't find Lily," Dan snapped. The room went quiet. Dan straightened. "I'm not trying to be a hero, but we have a pattern. We have a person out there who isn't done." The captain leaned back. "I'll elevate it, quietly. But don't go rogue again." Dan nodded once, then turned and walked out with Echo at his side. That evening, Dan visited Lily again. She was drawing with crayons, simple shapes and stick figures. One of them was a dog. When she saw him, she smiled. "I told Mom I want to be like Echo when I grow up," she said. Dan grinned. "You mean strong and quiet?" She nodded. "And brave." Echo nudged her hand with his nose. She giggled. Back home, Dan updated his board. Now it wasn't just 1 dot. It was 6. 6 towns, 6 parks. 6 girls who'd gone missing and been found quickly, shaken but unharmed. And all 6 towns had been visited by one black SUV spotted on local gas station cameras. Dan pinned the photo to the center. Echo lay beneath the board, watching, waiting. Because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Echo stood at the edge of the map in Dan's living room, staring up at the board like he understood it. 6 push pins marked 6 towns, 6 girls, 6 near misses, and 1 black SUV. Dan Ruiz hadn't slept in almost 30 hours. Coffee didn't help anymore. It just made his hands shake faster. He had a folder stuffed with grainy security cam screenshots, timestamps, police notes, and unofficial tips scribbled in blue pen. But no name, no face, no suspect. Yet. He glanced down at Echo, who was still tail twitching like a clock hand, waiting to strike the hour. "You ready to find him?" Dan asked. Echo stood. Answer received. The SUV had been seen last in a town called Silverside, just under 2 hours east. A quiet stretch of rural highway, mostly orchards and long-haul truck stops. The local cops chalked it up to a random vehicle passing through. Dan didn't believe in random anymore. He packed Echo into the back of his unmarked Explorer and headed east just before sunrise. No sirens, no backup. Just a man and a dog chasing something the system had decided not to see. They arrived in Silverside by 8:15 a.m. Dan didn't stop at the police station. Instead, he headed straight to the last confirmed sighting, the parking lot of a convenience store near Route 39. The clerk remembered the SUV. Slick black, tinted windows. Guy didn't come in, just sat in the lot for a while. "Did you get a plate?" Dan asked. The man scratched his chin. "Nope, no front plate. Kinda shady, to be honest." Dan pulled out his phone, showed the clerk a blurry cam still. "That's it, that's the one." Dan and Echo canvassed the area for an hour. Echo sniffed around the lot, then circled to the back where a drainage ditch separated the pavement from a line of dense trees. There he stopped. Dan knew the signs. Ears forward, body stiff, tail low but alert. "Got something?" Echo moved forward, slow and focused. The trail led them into the brush, over a bent wire fence, and through a section of woods that opened into a clearing. In the center sat an old barn, abandoned, half-collapsed, with rusted tools still hanging from the outside walls. Echo paused near the door, then barked once. Dan drew his sidearm. The inside of the barn was cold and smelled of mold and gasoline. Old tarps covered something in the corner. Echo growled and moved toward them. Dan pulled one back. A set of large plastic bins. One was filled with fast food wrappers, another with zip ties and duct tape. The third, children's clothes. Dan froze. A pink shoe, a red backpack with faded stickers. He took photos of everything, careful not to touch. Echo barked again, sharper now. At the back of the barn, behind a sagging hay bale, was a trap door. Dan opened it. A tunnel, not long, maybe 15 feet, dug into the dirt, reinforced with plywood. Echo wouldn't go in. He sat at the entrance and whined. That was enough for Dan. He backed out, heart racing. He called Mia. "You're not going to believe what we just found." He texted her the location and photos. "This guy's not just moving around, he's planting, creating safe spots." Mia's reply came quickly. "Predators sometimes do that, stash houses, hidden prep zones. It's worse than we thought." Dan nodded even though she couldn't see him. "Yeah, it is." Dan wanted to stay, stake it out, wait for the guy to return. But protocol and gut instinct told him to lock it down and walk away. They needed a net, not a shootout. He flagged the location anonymously through a task force contact, hoping that would keep it under wraps just long enough. Then he and Echo drove back to the main road. Dan stopped at a gas station to fill up. As he stood beside the pump, Echo let out a low growl. Dan looked up. Across the street, parked beside a row of mailboxes, was a black SUV. The windows were dark. Engine running. No plate? Dan's heart slammed into his ribs. He reached for his radio, then stopped. They didn't have jurisdiction. They didn't have a warrant. They didn't even have probable cause. But they had Echo, and Echo wasn't blinking. Dan decided to trust the dog. He pulled out of the station, made a casual loop through the neighborhood, then parked behind a taco truck. With a view of the SUV, he killed the engine. "Okay, buddy," he said quietly. "Let's see who this guy is." For 10 minutes, nothing. Then the driver's side door opened. Out stepped a man in a hoodie and baseball cap. Medium build, jeans, clean sneakers. No visible weapon. He walked around to the back of the SUV, opened the hatch, pulled out a trash bag. Dan squinted. It looked heavy. The man carried it behind a small storage shed and disappeared from view. Dan got out slowly. Echo followed, moving low and quiet. They crossed the street, staying tight against fences and dumpsters. At the corner of the shed, Dan peeked. The man was kneeling, digging with a small shovel, burying the bag. Dan raised his phone and took a burst of photos. Then he stepped out. "Sheriff's Department. Don't move." The man froze, looked up, then bolted. Dan ran. "Echo, track!" The dog surged forward, gaining ground fast. The man made it 50 yards before Echo caught his leg and brought him down hard. Dan cuffed him moments later. By the time backup arrived, Dan had already retrieved the bag. Inside were photos, dozens, of kids, playgrounds, schoolyards, parks, some recent, some not. None of them belonged to him. The man was taken in under suspicion of stalking and child endangerment. He refused to speak without a lawyer. But the photos alone were enough to open serious federal interest. Dan sat outside the precinct that night, Echo curled beside him. Mia called. "You did it," she said. Dan shook his head. "No, we did it." He looked down at Echo. "He did." The next day, Dan visited Lily again. She was stronger now, smiling more. When she saw him, she ran up and hugged Echo. "I knew he was magic," she said. Dan laughed. "He's just a dog." She shook her head. "No, he's the dog." Back at home, Dan added one final pin to the board. Silverside. Echo rested at his feet, eyes closed, peaceful for the first time in days. But Dan knew there'd be more. Because monsters don't stop on their own. They stop when someone like Echo finds them and refuses to let go. Dan Ruiz didn't want the commendation. After the black SUV was impounded, after the photos of children were entered into evidence, and after the FBI quietly swept in to take over the multi-state surveillance case, someone at the mayor's office decided the town needed a good headline. They gave Echo a ribbon and a plaque. They offered Dan a staged press release and a handshake. He took none of it. What he wanted was a name. What he wanted was proof that this man, the one now sitting in federal custody refusing to speak, hadn't just been watching kids. He'd done something worse. He wanted to know what was missing, not just what had been found. Back home, Echo wasn't sleeping well. He paced the hall, whined near the basement door, sat at windows with his ears back. "He knows something's not done," Dan told Mia on the phone. "It's not just behavior. He feels it." Mia didn't argue. Dogs like Echo. They're like tuning forks for trauma. He might not know what's wrong, but he knows something is still out there. Dan rubbed his forehead. The guy isn't talking. Won't give up a single location. What about the maps? Every one of them led to a dump site. Hidden gear, no victims. Yet! Echo barked sharply the next morning while Dan was reviewing case files. It wasn't just a bark, it was a summon. Dan followed him into the hallway. Echo stood frozen, nose pointed at the floor vent. He gave a soft whine, then tapped the vent cover with his paw. Dan crouched. The metal was cold, old. Something below? He grabbed a screwdriver and pried it loose. What he saw made his stomach lurch. A small, fabric-covered book, stuffed into the duct like someone never wanted it found. He pulled it out, wiped away dust. It was a child's diary. The name on the first page. Samantha D. The date? October 12th, 2016. It was old. Older than Lily. Dan brought it to Mia. She read it slowly, flipping pages with the care of someone unwrapping a bomb. "This girl talks about being locked in a place," she whispered. "About hearing footsteps and voices. About someone who left food but never let her out. Dan's hands curled into fists. Was she ever reported missing? Mia ran the name. No matches, but the handwriting was real. The emotions, real. There were too many details for it to be fiction. And in the back of the diary, a drawing. A dog, with the words, "I heard him, but he didn't find me." Dan felt his chest go cold. This wasn't Lily. No, Mia said softly. This was someone before her. Dan went back to the barn near Silverside, now locked down with federal tape. He used a contact to get inside, quietly. Echo sniffed the edges of the room again. But this time, he did something different. He went to the back wall, sat, whined, then pawed gently at the floorboards. Dan pried one up. Another space. Another crawl tunnel. Inside, a blanket. Empty juice boxes. And a set of small ballet slippers covered in dust. Dan's breath caught. They had missed her. They called in ground-penetrating radar. Sent cadaver dogs. Found 3 more dugouts like that, empty, but lived in. They began reclassifying the case. Serial abduction. Dan stood on the edge of one hole and whispered, "How many didn't we save?" Echo whined, and then barked, at nothing, or maybe at something only he could feel. That night, Dan sat by Echo and opened the diary again. He read every page, this time with a pen in hand, circling any name, landmark, or time. One thing stood out. A repeated reference to the house with yellow stairs. He ran it by Mia. There's no address? No, just that, over and over. The house with yellow stairs. Mia narrowed her eyes. That's not much to go on. Echo doesn't need much. The next few days were spent driving through rural back roads. Echo rode in the front now, more alert than ever. They passed farms, tool sheds, motels, nothing. Until Thursday morning, Dan stopped at a gas station for coffee and came out to find Echo standing on the hood of the truck, ears forward, body tense. "What is it?" Echo leapt off and ran toward a nearby property. An old ranch house set back from the road, fenced in, overgrown. And at the front porch, yellow-painted wooden stairs. Dan's stomach dropped. He called it in as a welfare check. Standard code. The deputy who responded was young, unsure. Dan waved his badge. "I'll take the lead." They knocked 3 times. No answer? The windows were dark, but not broken. Dan circled the house, found a shed in the back. Echo growled the moment the door opened. Inside, Tishumus eyed, a cot, a bucket, a lock from the outside. Dan stepped back. This isn't a shed, it's a cage. A warrant was issued within the hour. Inside the house, they found files. Hundreds of them. Photos. Names, handwritten notes. Only one room was used. The rest of the house was storage. Boxes of clothes, old shoes, even school ID cards. Echo sat in the center of it all, still, tired, but watching. 3 more victims were identified, all rescued, all relocated since. Each of them had told a different story. But now, it was one story. One man, one network, one dog that never gave up. Dan met Lily again at a school presentation. They asked him to bring Echo. She was standing in the front row, a little taller now, hair neatly braided. When she saw Echo, she ran forward. He wagged his tail and let her hug him. "I told my class you saved me," she said. "But I know you don't like being the center of attention." Dan smiled. He likes people like you more than cameras. Later that day, Dan sat on the porch with Echo beside him. The wind was soft. No sirens, no urgency. He looked down at his partner. "You tired?" Echo blinked slowly. Dan leaned back. "We might not get every one of them, but you gave us a start." Echo laid his head on Dan's boot. The mission wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like they were ahead. Dan Ruiz wasn't a rule-breaker by nature, but when you spend enough time chasing ghosts, ones that breathe, walk, and disappear just before you reach them, rules start to feel less like protection and more like blinders. That's why when the FBI ordered the case sealed, Dan didn't argue. He just quietly made copies of everything. It had been 2 weeks since the discovery at the ranch house with the yellow stairs. 3 girls had been reunited with their families. 2 suspects had been quietly arrested in other counties, connected through notes found in the files. But the man in the black SUV? Still silent, still nameless. He refused to identify himself. No priors, no prints, no spoken word since his arrest. Some agents believed he was just a pawn. Others believed he was something worse. Dan believed he was both. And Echo? Echo wouldn't rest. He still paced at night, still scratched at the same door, still stared at shadows longer than necessary. Dan knew that behavior. It meant something was unfinished. Something was still out there. Dan met Mia at a quiet diner off I-84. Booth by the window, coffee already waiting. "I'm tired," she said before he even sat down. "Say..." They exchanged a look, the kind you only get after sharing something dark. "Any updates?" he asked. "Feds are bottling it. They think the media storm will die down if they go silent." "They're wrong." She leaned in. "Dan, I got a call from a foster home in Sheridan. Girl said she saw a man watching her school. Described the SUV, same description. Even said he had a limp." Dan's eyebrows lifted. "A limp?" "Yeah." Dan leaned back, processing. "There was a fourth dugout," he said slowly. "Back near the barn. Smaller, barely used." "I remember." "You think it was his?" Dan didn't answer. Echo shifted under the table, ears twitching. "He's not done," Dan said. "No, he's not." By the next morning, Dan had made his decision. He wasn't waiting on permission. He and Echo headed to Sheridan in civilian clothes. No badge, no announcement, just observation. The school was surrounded by farmland and a church across the road. Perfect for someone to sit and watch without being noticed. Dan parked 2 blocks away and walked Echo on foot. They made one slow lap around the perimeter. Nothing. But on the second pass, Echo stopped near a row of trash bins. He lowered his head, sniffed once, then growled. Dan knelt. Beneath the trash bins, hidden under wet cardboard, was a white baseball cap. Plain, but inside the brim, smudged, almost invisible, was a single letter. S. Dan bagged it, no questions. They stayed in town, slept in the truck that night. Parked behind an abandoned gas station. Echo curled up in the passenger seat, eyes open even when his body rested. Around 2 a.m., Echo sat up sharply. Dan blinked awake. "What is it?" Echo whined, then stared out the windshield. A black SUV rolled slowly past the main intersection. No lights, no music, just motion. Dan's heart pounded. He waited until it turned the corner, then started the engine and followed. No headlights, low beam from the dashboard. They tracked it to an old trailer park just outside city limits. It pulled into lot number 27. Parked. No one got out. Dan watched for 20 minutes. Stillness. Then Echo growled deep and low. That was enough. Dan didn't call local PD. He didn't have time to be told no. He slipped from the truck, flashlight and sidearm in hand. Echo followed without a command. They approached the trailer. Metal siding rusted, front porch sagging. No lights inside. Dan crept up the steps, Echo just behind. He knocked once. Nothing. He knocked again. A shuffle inside. Then silence. "Sheriff's Department," Dan called. "Open the door." Still silence. Then, a crash. Back window. Running feet. Dan and Echo bolted around the trailer in time to see a figure running through the back field, limping slightly. "Echo, take!" The dog launched, connected mid-sprint. They both went down hard. Dan cuffed the man seconds later. The man was shaking, but still said nothing. Dan pulled the wallet from his pocket. Inside, no ID, but folded in the cash was a photo. A young girl. Not Lily. Not any of the rescued girls. Someone new. Dan handed the man over to the feds the next morning. They processed him quietly, like it was just another day at the office. But Dan stayed behind. He had one more visit to make. The photo led him to a small town 3 hours east. Population 900. The girl's name was Emily. She'd been missing for 2 months. The locals had assumed she'd run away, but Dan knocked on her mother's door and placed the photo gently into her hands. She collapsed. Echo stood behind Dan, tail down, head lowered. Emily was found a week later, in a locked basement 3 counties over. Alive. Barely, but alive. Dan returned to the station to find a letter in his mailbox. It was from the sheriff. You're officially suspended pending review of unauthorized field action. Dan folded it neatly, then placed it in the trash. He walked out to his truck. Echo was waiting. They drove home in silence. No music, no radio, just the sound of wind and the soft tapping of Echo's tail against the back seat. Dan didn't need the badge. He had Echo, and together they were still doing what mattered. Still listening to the sounds no one else heard. Still chasing what everyone else had given up on. And they weren't done yet. Not even close. It was strange not wearing the badge. After 15 years in uniform, Dan Ruiz felt naked without it. Not just because it wasn't on his chest anymore, but because everything it used to represent, authority, protection, rules, had become too small for what he and Echo had walked through. Sometimes doing the right thing meant stepping outside the lines, and sometimes it meant trusting a dog more than the chain of command. The town didn't talk about what happened. Not in newspapers, not on the radio. The black SUV had been impounded. 2 more storage sites had been uncovered across state lines. 5 girls had been rescued in total. One, Emily, still hadn't spoken a full sentence since she was found. Another had begun drawing dogs in every crayon sketch she made. Big dogs with gentle eyes and gold badges on their collars. Dan didn't want credit, but he wasn't going to forget them. Not any of them. Echo was slower now. Age and work had worn into his bones. He limped more on cold mornings, slept deeper at night. The once alert, always ready stare had softened around the edges. But if Dan put his boots on and opened the truck door, Echo still rose, still wagged his tail, still looked at him like, "We got more to do." Dan didn't say no. He just drove. One day, a teacher named Hannah from Lincoln Elementary reached out. She'd read about Echo, quietly, through a friend of a friend, and wanted to know if he'd come visit her 4th grade class. "They've been talking about bravery," she wrote, "but they don't really know what it looks like." Dan said yes. That Friday, Echo wore his old canine vest. Faded, scratched, but still strong. Dan stood in front of 20 wide-eyed kids in plastic chairs, most of them still finishing their chocolate milk from lunch. He told them about Echo, not the headlines, not the rescues, but the parts no one saw. How Echo would wait in the dark without flinching. How he could smell fear and follow it. How he never barked unless it mattered. "He's not magic," Dan said, his hand resting on Echo's back. "He's just a dog who doesn't quit, even when the rest of us want to." A boy raised his hand. "Did he ever save you?" Dan smiled. "More times than I'll ever be able to count." Afterward, the kids came up one by one to pet Echo. Some shy, some bold. One little girl whispered into his ear like he was a secret keeper. Another slipped a dog treat into Dan's hand and said, "He earned it." Echo took it like a gentleman. That night, Dan sat on his porch and watched the sun sink into the wheat fields behind his house. Echo lay beside him, snoring softly. Dan sipped a beer and whispered, "We did good, partner." Echo didn't wake, but his tail tapped twice. A few weeks later, Dan got a call from the governor's office. They wanted to name a new canine search and rescue program after Echo. Dan almost said no, but Mia talked him into it. "It's not for you," she said. "It's for the next kid, and the dog that finds them." So he agreed, on one condition. It wouldn't be a shiny building or a press stunt. It would be a fund, one that paid for shelter dogs, rescued, just like Echo once was, to be trained as canine support animals for departments that couldn't afford the programs. They called it Echo Response. In the first year, Echo Response trained 7 dogs. 4 of them found missing children in the Pacific Northwest. 2 were placed in school districts as emotional support animals. 1 was retired early, adopted by a little girl named Leah, the first child Echo had ever found on duty. She named the dog Ranger. Dan didn't wear the badge again, but people still called. Detectives, teachers, parents. "Can you come talk to our volunteers? Would Echo sit with this girl during testimony? Would you mind checking something out?" Dan never charged. He showed up every time. And one morning, just before Christmas, Dan woke to find Echo gone. Not missing, just outside. lying in the yard, facing the sun, still peaceful. Tail curled around his back legs. Dan knelt beside him for a long time, said nothing, cried some, then whispered, "You found your last one, didn't you?" They buried him under the oak tree beside the house. Neighbors came. So did some of the kids Echo had helped over the years, now older, taller, but with the same soft eyes when they looked at the empty leash. Mia placed his vest on a chair. Dan didn't give a speech. He just said he never stopped looking, and he never stopped feeling. That was enough. Months passed. Dan built a bench beneath the tree. People left toys, flowers, treats in sandwich bags. One child wrote, in crayon, "Echo didn't talk, but I heard him." Dan still drove sometimes, still watched playgrounds and dirt roads, still took in the air, and wondered where the next cry for help might come from. He trained one more dog, not as sharp, not as fast, but eager. One day, that dog froze at the sound of a faint whimper during a school fire drill. Found a 6-year-old locked in a janitor's closet, too scared to yell. Dan smiled. Maybe the best of Echo lived on, in instinct, in kindness, in refusal to walk away. Thank you for following this journey with Echo. From a quiet canine partner to a relentless protector, a lifeline for children in the darkest places. His story reminds us that heroes don't always wear uniforms. Some come on 4 legs, without words, and still manage to say everything. If Echo's story moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who believes in second chances, silent strength, and the bond between people and animals. And we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment when an animal sensed something no one else could? Tell us your story in the comments below. Until next time, thank you for being part of Heroes for Animals.